Okay. So to start off with, you can see my title's different. Actually, I put a poll on Facebook to see what people maybe wanted to hear about. But actually, my student Leanna came across some interesting image or interesting thing in the field, which I'll talk about later. And so I decided to switch my talk to abiotic disorders, especially given all of the rain that we've been having and the extreme weather, which can impact the number of abiotic disorders that you see. So an abiotic disorder is a disorder that's caused by a non-infectious agent. And I underline infectious because sometimes when I talk about two of them, which are specifically related to saprophytic microorganisms, you'll hear people call these a disease, when actually, even though they're caused by a microorganism, it's usually a secondary effect that occurred from some other type of damage that occurred to the plant, or in this case, the grape. So some examples of abiotic disorders include nutrient or water imbalances, temperature extremes, air pollution, mechanical damage can cause what appears to be a disease but actually ends up being an abiotic disorder. Toxic chemicals, genetic defects, and then lastly, the saprophytic microorganisms. So basically anything that's not an infectious living agent or a virus. So I'm going to focus only on a few today because there are many, many abiotic disorders that impact grape, but these are the ones that I get the most calls about from the growers. And these ones are often misdiagnosed by the grower and sometimes by others as an actual biotic disease when really they're abiotic disorders. And so what I want to try and do in this 30 minutes or so is show you what the abiotic disorder looks like and then talk about what diseases it gets confused with. And so that will hopefully give you the ability when you're in the field to try and figure out whether or not you have this abiotic disorder or whether you're dealing with an actual disease. And this is particularly useful right now since we are still at home for the next few weeks anyways, and this will allow you to do some of the diagnostics yourself in your field. So we're going to talk about rupestris speckle, adventitious roots, bunch stem necrosis, ozone injury, and then two disorders that are caused by saprophytic microorganisms, orange slime and sour rot. And then if we have some time, we'll talk about herbicide injury. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on herbicide injury, but I'm going to introduce it so that next week when you hop on and listen to Dr. Doug Dewin, he'll go into much more detail about one, how to control weeds in the vineyard, but also how to recognize herbicide injury and what to do if you do have herbicide injury. So the first one is rupestris speckle, and I think probably most growers are familiar with this. It's basically an unknown physiological disorder that causes these necrotic spots on the leaves. And generally the spots are fairly uniform. So if you look on the, I'll switch out my pointer here. But if you look here, these necrotic spots, there's slight chlorosis or yellowing around it, and they seem to be fairly uniform on the plant. In all cultivars can get this rupestris speckle, but ones with the Vitis rupestris heritage or background in them, such as Chambourcin, tend to be more affected than other cultivars. And so you can see by first glance that this might look like several diseases that we know of that are caused by fungi. If we take a look at the pattern again, I said often it's uniform. So here, this is a picture on Chambourcin, and you can see that the speckles are smaller and cover almost the entire, or spread evenly along across the leaf. Where if you look on Frontenac Gris, you can see that they're a darker color darker brown and tend to be a bit bigger. And then if you look on Valvin muscat, this is interesting because to me this looks like a lot like downy mildew. And unless I went on to, look for the sporulation on the underside of the leaf, I probably from a digital image wouldn't say right away that this is rupestris speckle. So it takes a little bit more sometimes depending on the variety of looking into what's going on to determine if it is rupestris speckle. But most of the time I get 3 or 4 samples a year, and it's usually on Chamberson that I see it. Now, because it's an unknown physiological disorder, there's no control measure. And unless it's really severe in the field or in the vines, it generally has minimal impact on the vigor of the plant or on the yield. So one of the main diseases that it's confused with is with the fungal disease black rot. And the way that you can determine this in the field is actually fairly simple. You can take a 10x hand lens, and in fact, sometimes you don't even need a hand lens. And if you look in the center of the lesion, you'll see these little black spots if it's black rot. And these are pycnidia, or fruiting structures from the fungus, and these will release conidia and spores. And when you have rupestris speckle, you will not see these. And so sometimes you might have both, but the majority of time you will not see these speckles or these little pycnidia spots for rupestris speckle. So fairly easy to identify. Why is it important? Well, because if you have black rot on the foliage to this level, then you need to start thinking about how you're managing black rot and maybe needing to change your fungicide spray program. However, if it's rupestris speckle, you can put all the fungicide on you want and it's not going to make a difference. So that's why it's important to diagnose it, so that if it is a fungal disease, you can get on top of it right away. Okay, so the next one I wanted to talk about is adventitious roots. And I saw a lot of this last year. And generally what happens are the vines put out these adventitious roots. And this is a muscadine vine. And you can see all of these hanging structures here. These are the adventitious roots. And these are formed when the plant is under some type of stress. And usually it's an adaptive response to drought. So it'll put out these adventitious roots in order to take up some water from the atmosphere, or from flooding. If the roots aren't able to pick up the water, then what happens is they put out these adventitious roots again to try and take water out of the atmosphere. It's also a common response that you'll see following a spring with a deep freeze. So if the vines are stressed environmentally, generally due to water or freeze damage, then you'll see these adventitious roots. And if you look, this is one that came in last year. It looks like a little haystack. It can be a little bit shocking to see it on your vine. Generally, if you don't have too many of them, it won't affect your vine in the long run, whether it's the vigor or the grape yield. However, if you have a severe case like this on a young vine, for instance, it could definitely affect the vigor in that year as well as the following year. Again, there aren't really any control measures other than things like making sure that you have good soil drainage. That's particularly important right now with all of the rain that we get, especially in the Northeast Ohio area. And also in the winter doing your cultural practices like hilling to protect the vines from winter injury. So basically you want to maintain a healthy plant so that if any of these stressors do come in, the plant will be able to handle it better. Okay, the next one is bunch stem necrosis. Again, seeing a lot of this because of the rainy weather that we continually have. This is, again, a physiological disorder, and it's caused by environmental stressors. And when you see it occur will often depend on the time of year. So low temperatures and high humidity at bloom, you'll see bunch stem necrosis. And then when you have too much water after horizon, you'll see them. And so you can see here that you have these necrotic lesions on the rachi and on the stems. And what it does is it basically constricts the flow of water to the bunches, and then they shrivel up and die off. A close up here on my right, you can see that you might see some of these lesions on the fruit where it's going to start to shrivel up, and then you can see the clear necrotic lesions on the rachis and on the stems. So there are other diseases that form mummies or that show symptoms that look like this. And again, it's important that you know the difference between them, because there are no control measures for bunch stem necrosis, but there are some control measures for the fungal diseases that may look like this. So the first thing when you're in the field and you see symptoms like this is generally it's right near harvest. It occurs after horizon, and so your grapes will look beautiful, and then all of a sudden you'll go out and you'll see uniformly through the block that your clusters are shriveling up. And so that's one way to distinguish it from a fungal disease, because generally, unless you have really, really poor disease control programs in place, the disease will not be uniform throughout your block. The other thing is that you won't see any fungal structures associated with these symptoms initially anyways, because as the tissue dies back, then you get some of the necrotrophic or the fungi that like to feed on dead material come in. But one disease, again, black rot, it can be confused with. And the way that you would distinguish black rot, and these are really nice images here, often you won't see it at this stage, you'll just see the complete mummy. But what happens is you get these sunken lesions, and then remember those pycnidia that we saw in the leaf lesions, they'll be all over the fruit as well. And again, if I can see it here, and I have really bad eyesight, you can see these raised bumps, those are the pycnidia. And then on the stem or the rachi, you'll also see that, and you can clearly see the pycnidia here. So that's how you would distinguish it. The other one that it often gets confused with is botrytis bunch rot. And it's not surprising that it can be confused with botrytis, because botrytis is one of those necrotrophic fungi that will feed on dead material. But with botrytis, you will see the spores right at the beginning when you start to see damage. And so if you look here on this grape here, you can see these fuzzy gray material. I think everybody is probably familiar with botrytis. If you have any type of potted plant outside right now, it probably has botrytis in it. All of my pansies have it right now. So it's basically ubiquitous in the environment, and it comes in when there's dead material, although it can be a primary disease in grape as well. So fairly easy again in the field to diagnose the difference and to tell the difference between the two. However, if you're not sure, again, you can always send me the samples and we can confirm it. At this stage, if you're at this stage close to harvest, you're probably out of luck in terms of managing it, but we can start to think about how you'll manage these fungal diseases in the next season. But unfortunately, in terms of bunch stem necrosis, there are no management strategies. And it can be very disappointing to go out one day and see that you have a beautiful crop, and then you get 2 days of rain and you go out the next day and it looks like this picture on the left here. Okay, ozone damage. This is actually fairly common and a lot of times is confused with a micronutrient or a macronutrient disorder. The symptoms for ozone damage, you get this speckling, rust-like appearance on the leaves. However, it's only on the upper side. If you turned it over, you wouldn't see this same discoloration. Again, fairly uniform on the leaves. And when you'll see this is about 2 to 3 days after there's been a high level of ozone in the air. So how do you know if this is due to ozone damage or a micronutrient? Well, the first thing I would recommend is that you go on to a website that's put out by the US government called airnow.gov, and it gives you details of what the risk level are, what the risk levels have been and are on this day for ozone damage, as well as for pollution particles. And so they've actually just revamped their website, and it's much easier to use, and they give you this nice picture when you enter in your zip code. So I entered in this morning Ashtabula zip code, and you can see that you're in the good level, which means that it's low risk for an high ozone event. What you're concerned with is when it gets up into this high level here, generally between 125 and 200. If you're in this level, then 2 to 3 days later, you may see ozone damage on your leaves. And if you have what you think is ozone damage, you can go back and look to see if there was a high risk event 2 to 3 days before that. And so what I want to do is click on this and show you. You can see this, everyone, popping up? I'm hoping so, because last time we couldn't. So Maria, let me know if you can't see it.
Hey Melanie, it's up.
Okay, great. So what you see here is you can type in your zip code, and then it gives you an outlook for the day. And if you look down, so this is current air quality, you can see that it's a 37, and this PM is pollution particles or material, and it's also good. What you can do then is you can go up to this little tab here. I'll zoom in. Can you see it here? Called Recent Trends. And if you click on the recent trends, it brings up a daily forecast. It brings up what the forecast over the last week was, and then it brings up the forecast for the last month. So if you see anything up above, I'll zoom in here. If you see anything above this 100 line, then that means there is a high risk for ozone, and you may see damage in your vineyard. So this is a really nice tool to use. I use it a lot in general. If I get in symptoms that look like the ones that I was showing you, to determine whether or not there's a potential for ozone. Because if it is ozone damage, then you don't have to do what my next recommendation would be if it is an ozone, and that would be to get nutrient testing done of both your foliage as well as your soil to determine if it might be a nutrient deficiency. Okay, so I just, in case the website didn't work, I put up this so you can see a larger view of it. This is what the map was, and I included a bit of Indiana in here. I'm trying to find here it is. So it's not just for Ohio, it's can be used for the whole country. And these yellow areas here, this is the pollution particle map. So this shows you where there's a pollution particle, and it's not color coded, so we know that that level was low. And you can actually select whether you want to see that or not. And it also will show you at a range of 2 to 2.5, and then 2.5 to 10 milligrams of particle unit, micrograms of the particle sizes. Okay. So that ends ozone. So the next one I want to talk about is this orange slime. And if you're on Facebook, you saw this. Leanna was out in our Traminette field last week and came across this. This is honestly the first time that I've ever seen it, although I've only been working with fruit crops since 2016. Before that, I was veggies. But you can see that it's pretty noticeable, and it can be pretty darn shocking when you see it. And basically what this orange slime is it's a complex of saprophytic fungi and yeast. and they are not infectious. They will not cause an infection and kill the vine. What happens is it usually occurs when there's heavy rain and high humidity following your pruning, or from a wounding, such as wounds that might have occurred during from frost or winter injury. And in some cases, this can actually ooze and drip. So if you can see here, this is a picture from Omafra from Wendy McFadden Smith. Some of you may know her, but you can see here that this will actually start to drip, like ooze, and go onto the ground. And again, while it's a bit shocking, it won't kill the vine, and eventually it'll just dry up as the weather dries up in the hot summer. Again, though, it can be shocking. There's nothing you can really do for it. So you just kind of wait it out. And here are some of the pathogenic fungi that have been associated with it. You'll see that there are 2 Fusarium species, but Fusarium is very host specific, and these 2 species do not infect grapevine. Okay, so if you see that, take some pictures, post them on my Facebook page on the Grape IPM, so that we can get the word out to show people what it looks like, and also give them some recommendations, which is basically do nothing and let it dry up. Okay, the last one I want to talk about before I just mention herbicide injuries, 3:30, so we're in good time, is sour rot. And a lot of times you'll hear plant pathologists and others talk about sour rot as a plant disease or a biotic disease. It actually is not. It's the result of initial injury that occurs along with an interaction with fruit flies. And so basically they've broken it down that you need the following 4 things in order to have sour rot occur. You need to have a wound, and that wound can be from an insect, it can be from a bird, it can be mechanical, that occurs during spraying. Any type of wound can initiate this process and initiate sour rot. The other thing is that it's associated with warmer weather, so it's generally less likely to appear in cooler weather. There's 2 microorganisms or microbes that play a role in it. There's non-pathogenic yeast, and these are the yeasts that are generally there that you want there for the fermentation process. And then there's also acetic acid forming bacteria. And these acetic acid forming bacteria allow you to diagnose it fairly easy in the field, because you'll go out to the field and it'll be very sour smelling, vinegar-like smell associated with the grapes. And that will help you distinguish it from something like botrytis that can often appear like this, like these browning or bruising of the grapes early on, as well as black rot early on can have this browning, bruising-like appearance. And then the last thing you need is the fruit fly. And the fruit fly comes in, and they don't know what the role of the fruit fly is, other than that if it's not present, all of the research has shown that you won't see sour rot in the absence of fruit fly. So there's some type of insect, microbe interaction, as well as the environment. And you would think, okay, you have to have 4 things happen at once, kind of the perfect storm, and it's probably unlikely. The problem is that these 4 things are fairly common, or very common, in the grape cluster. So you often have fruit flies, you will often have wounding, you have non-pathogenic yeast present, and then you can have these acetic acid forming bacteria. And so what happens is when the wound occurs, then the bacteria and yeast start to grow, then that attracts the insects, including the fruit fly, but you'll often see, this is a bumblebee, which is okay, but you'll often see yellow jackets or other insects swarming around it. Now, if you look on this one, you can see here that this is actually black rot on here, but there are other woundings that occur. So it's not as if you won't see other diseases associated with it. And these pictures were taken by Bruce Bordelin at Purdue. And if you go and Google this. He has some very nice pictures of sour rot on his webpage. Okay, so how do we manage it? So this picture here was taken at the Kingsville Research Station, and you can see it's not as clear as Bruce's pictures, but you can see that there's some ladybugs here. I don't know, Elizabeth might know what this thing is. Is it a wasp? Maybe.
It's like a fly.
Okay.
A big meaty one.
But you'll often see a lot of insects around them, especially at this late stage, and they'll stink. They'll have this vinegar smell associated with them. So this is one abiotic disorder that you can actually be pretty successful with managing. And the first thing you want to do is to control the fruit flies. So this is your primary management practice. And so they've noticed that in almost all cases, sour rot doesn't occur until the grapes are 15 bricks or higher. So what you want to do is go in just before they reach 15 bricks and start to put preventative sprays, insecticide sprays on. And the recommendations are Mustang Max, Delegate, and Malathion. And I'm going to have Elizabeth pipe in about whether or not these are different modes of action, but I do want to state that you need to make sure that you alternate your modes of action, similar to what I always am saying about fungicides, so that you can prevent resistance build up. Okay, the second step is to use a biological control to manage the microbes. So these are the acetic acid bacteria and the yeast. And there are three different types of biocontrols that have been tested. Most of this work was done by Megan Hall when she was at Cornell. And she's found that blight ban, which is a Pseudomonas, double nickel, which is a bacillus, and serenade, which is a bacillus, work well to control these microbes. There's also recommendations for oxidate. I'm not a big fan of oxidate, but it can also be used in the rotation. Now, unlike fungicides or insecticides, you don't have to worry about resistance building up with using these products. However, they are not systemic, which means that they're contact and that you have to reapply them frequently in order for them to be effective. So whereas you would apply insecticides on a 7 to 10 day schedule, for these biocontrols, you're talking about a 3 to 5 day schedule. So it's intensive management. Luckily, it's just once those grapes, are pre-15 bricks that you would start the program. So it's not a season-long program. A lot of people ask, should I remove the grapes? And yes, you should remove them, especially if there's just a few, because those rotting grapes, those sour grapes, are going to just attract more and more fruit flies and insects, which will just perpetuate the problem. However, do not drop them to the ground. This is where you need to put them in a bucket or a wagon and take them out, because even on the ground, they'll still attract the insects. I put a copy here of the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. If you don't have it, you can get it online, and sour rot management is listed on page 90. And it also gives a nice little description of what I just overviewed on the abiotic disorder. Okay. So lastly, I just want to give you a brief introduction to herbicide injury. And as I mentioned, Doug Doohan will be talking more about this next week, so that I encourage you to attend and hear what he has to say. This is glyphosate or Roundup injury. You get the blackening of the veins and you get some crinkling of the leaves. If you look here on the right, this also has phomopsis, by the way, these little black specks or necrotic specks with chlorosis or yellowing around them, that's phomopsis. Phomopsis can also cause the leaf to wrinkle. But if you look here, these lesions here are very characteristic of Roundup. Depending on the severity, the grapevines or the leaves will recover from it. And however, if the damage is pretty bad, you'll see symptoms next season. And you will also see symptoms next season if you have a late fall Roundup injury. Dicamba is pretty easy to recognize because it causes cupping. So you have the leaves cup upward, and you'll also see that the tendrils here, they become spiral and deformed. And you can see here that you do see some crinkling as well, but the key diagnostic characteristic is the upward cupping. And here's a fact sheet is listed below in the left-hand corner by Doug that goes more into this. These are some classic 2,4-D injury from Omafra. We see this a lot, even in our research plots. You can see that the leaves are strapping and that you have the venal chlorosis or yellowing of the veins. It's very easy to see down here. Not so easy to recover from as compared to glyphosate or Roundup damage. And just to mention briefly the Drift Watch, if you are not a member of Drift Watch, I highly encourage you to become a member. It's free, and what it does is your vineyards get registered on a statewide database, and then anybody who's spraying dicamba or 2,4-D has to go to this site to look to see what specialty crops are in their region, and then they have to make the specialty crop grower aware that a spray is going to occur. So Doug is going to go into more detail on this, but if you want to take some time and look it up between now and next week to get an idea about it, and that probably will make it a little bit easier to go through next week. So that's all I have. Here's my contact information, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, or we have this open chat session now if you have questions about other things like insect pests or cultural practices. And Elizabeth, if you could just address those 3 insecticides, are they all the same mode of action?
They are not actually. That's an excellent rotation that you lined up there. If folks followed that, you would be using 3 different classes of insecticides, which is awesome. The one thing I'll mention though is the malathion. I think there's some limits on, I don't have the label in front of me, but there's a limited number of applications each year. So you might not be able to use it as freely as the other 2 products, but it's a great rotation, those 3 products that you have there.